He only stopped because his dog refused to move. Rain was blinding. Thunder shook the road. Then, a car flew past them, slammed into a tree, and burst into flames. That decision saved a life. But by the next morning, it would cost him everything. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this only reach more people because of your support, and what's coming next changes everything. Rain slammed the highway like it was trying to erase it from existence. Visibility was nearly zero, the kind of storm that made sane people pull over and wait it out. But Jonah Hale didn't slow down. He couldn't. He had learned long ago that hesitation was sometimes deadlier than speed. The deserted stretch of Route 19 twisted through towering pines, their branches thrashing violently, bending like mourners at a graveside. Lightning ripped open the sky, briefly revealing the soaked asphalt before plunging it back into darkness. Jonah's aging pickup rattled as it pushed forward, headlights swallowed almost instantly by the storm. At 41, Jonah carried himself like a man permanently braced for impact. His shoulders stayed tight, jaw clenched, eyes always scanning. War had trained him that way. So had loss. The faint scar along his cheek caught the flash of lightning, a quiet reminder of nights far worse than this one. Beside him sat Atlas. The German Shepherd was calm but alert, amber eyes sharp, ears twitching at every thunderclap. Atlas wasn't just a dog. He was a former service canine, trained in places Jonah still dreamed about and tried to forget. The dog's breathing was steady, but something about his posture had shifted. He leaned forward slightly, muscles tense. Jonah noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" he muttered. Atlas didn't growl right away. He never did unless it mattered. But then, low and deliberate, the sound rolled from his chest, a warning Jonah recognized deep in his bones. Before Jonah could react, lightning split the sky and revealed a nightmare ahead. A sedan spun wildly across the road, tires screaming as it lost control. For one sickening moment, it hovered sideways, then slammed into a massive pine tree with a bone-crushing crack. Sparks erupted, smoke followed, then fire. Jonah slammed the brakes. The truck skidded before stopping hard. Atlas barked once, sharp, urgent. Jonah didn't think. He threw the door open and ran straight into the storm, rain soaking him instantly. Atlas was already beside him, paws splashing through pooled water as they raced toward the burning wreck. Inside the car, trapped behind twisted metal, was an elderly woman. Her silver hair clung to her face, eyes wide with terror. She shook violently, not just from the crash, but from the thunder. It wasn't fear alone. It was memory. "Please," she gasped. "Please don't leave me." The flames climbed fast. Jonah yanked at the door. It wouldn't budge. Heat burned his palms. Atlas circled, barking sharply, short bursts that meant move now. With one final, desperate pull, the door gave. Jonah tore the seatbelt free, lifted her into his arms, and ran. 3 seconds later, the car exploded. The shockwave knocked him to one knee. Fire roared behind them. The woman screamed into his chest. Jonah shielded her with his body as Atlas stood guard, unmoving. She was alive. By morning, she would be safe. By evening, Jonah would be fired. And neither of them yet understood that this night wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something far bigger. But what the woman whispered next, while staring into Atlas's eyes, would change Jonah's life forever. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this only reach more people because of your support. And what's coming next changes everything. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm had never existed. Pale sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, settling gently over wooden floors scarred by time. Jonah Hale stood at the small stove, stirring oatmeal he barely planned to eat himself. He moved slowly, deliberately, like sudden noise might fracture the fragile calm holding the room together. On the couch behind him, the woman from the crash slept under a heavy wool blanket. Her breathing was shallow, but steady now. In daylight, she looked older than Jonah had first thought, early 60s maybe, but there was a dignity to her features that suggested she'd once lived a life untouched by fear. Her red coat hung neatly by the door, dried and brushed clean, as if chaos hadn't torn through it hours earlier. Atlas lay at her feet, not curled up, not resting, watching. Jonah noticed that immediately. He carried a tray over and set it gently on the table beside her. The faint clink of ceramic stirred her awake. Her eyes flew open, panic flaring, until she saw Atlas. The dog didn't move. He simply placed one paw against the couch cushion, steady and grounding. "You're safe," Jonah said quietly. "Storm's gone." She exhaled shakily, pressing her chest to her chin. "I thought I was dreaming." "No, you're really here," Jonah replied. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you for not leaving me." Jonah shrugged. "Didn't feel like a choice." She smiled faintly at that, then looked down at Atlas. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. Atlas leaned forward just enough to meet her touch. "He knew," she whispered. Jonah frowned. "Knew what?" "That I was about to crash. Before it happened. I saw him through the windshield just before I lost control. He was already watching me." Atlas lifted his head, amber eyes locked on hers. Something unreadable passed between them. "My name is Eleanor," she added after a pause. "Eleanor Whitmore." Jonah introduced himself, then poured her tea. As she drank, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Far away, harmless. Still, Eleanor flinched hard, tea sloshing in the cup. 30 years ago," she said suddenly, "I lost my husband and my son in a storm just like that." Her voice stayed steady, but her hands betrayed her. Highway, rain, fire. Jonah didn't interrupt. "I haven't driven in weather since. Last night was supposed to be different. I thought maybe the fear had finally loosened its grip." Atlas shifted closer. Eleanor swallowed. "When your dog looks at me, it feels like he remembers something I've never said out loud." Jonah felt a chill crawl up his spine. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the counter, a message from work. Short, cold. "Don't bother coming in. We'll discuss your tardiness later." Jonah stared at the screen. He didn't know yet that later would never come. But Eleanor hadn't come back into Jonah's life by chance, and the reason she recognized Atlas would soon unravel a truth neither of them were ready for. The first thing Jonah noticed when he arrived at the diner was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. This was the tense, watchful quiet that settled just before something went wrong. Plates still clattered, orders were still called, but conversations dipped the moment he walked through the back door. Jonah checked the clock. 6 minutes late. Normally, no one would have cared. Today, it felt like a crime. He tied his apron, took his station, and got to work. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory carrying him forward, while his mind stayed back in the cabin with Eleanor and Atlas. The way the dog had looked at her hadn't left Jonah's thoughts. It wasn't instinct alone. It was recognition. Halfway through the breakfast rush, thunder cracked outside, loud, sudden, unnatural against a mostly clear sky. Jonah froze for a fraction of a second. Outside, Atlas howled. Not a bark, a howl. Jonah's stomach dropped. Atlas only made that sound when danger was imminent. The last time Jonah had heard it, men hadn't made it home. "What was that?" someone muttered. Before Jonah could move, the floor manager, Greg Mallory, stormed across the kitchen, face flushed with irritation. "That dog again?" Greg snapped loudly. "Your personal alarm system is disrupting service." Jonah opened his mouth to explain, but Greg didn't wait. "And you're late," Greg added, voice rising just enough for others to hear. "Again." "It was an emergency," Jonah said evenly. "A car crash. I helped." "Save it," Greg cut in. "This is a restaurant, not your therapy session." A few cooks avoided Jonah's eyes. Others looked down. No one spoke up. Greg folded his arms. "I warned you about reliability." Jonah felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, but disbelief. "You're really doing this?" Greg's smile was thin. "You made the choice." By noon, Jonah was standing outside with his apron folded in his hands. Fired. 6 minutes late for saving a life. Atlas pressed against his leg, silent now, steady as ever. Jonah rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "Guess it's just us again," he murmured. Across town, Eleanor sat in the back seat of her driver's car, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stared out the window as rain clouds gathered again on the horizon. Her phone rested in her palm, glowing with a single message she'd just received. He was terminated this morning. Her expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. "He saved my life," she whispered. That afternoon, Jonah returned home to find something that didn't belong there. A man standing near his mailbox. The stranger pretended to check his phone, but Atlas reacted instantly, stepping forward, muscles rigid, a low growl vibrating from his chest. The man flinched, dropped something, and fled down the street without a word. Jonah picked up what had fallen. A small black flash drive. No label, no explanation. Jonah stared at it, unease settling in. "So here's the question for you. If you were fired for saving someone's life, would you walk away or fight back? And what do you think Atlas sensed that day? Danger or something much darker?" Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what Jonah discovered on that flash drive would expose a lie far bigger than one cruel manager and put everything at risk. Jonah didn't sleep that night. The flash drive sat on the kitchen table like a loaded weapon, small and silent, yet heavy with threat. Atlas lay at his feet, head up, eyes fixed on the door as if he expected it to burst open at any moment. Every creak of the house, every distant car passing on the road set Jonah's nerves on edge. Just after midnight, he plugged the drive into his old laptop. The screen flickered. A single folder appeared. Incident Review. Jonah's jaw tightened. He clicked. Video footage filled the screen, security camera angles from the diner's kitchen. At first, everything looked normal. Him at the stove, Greg hovering nearby, orders moving fast. Then the footage jumped. Frames skipped unnaturally. Timestamps lurched forward. A burner flared without being touched. A pan appeared to smoke before it was even on the heat. Audio warped, voices stitched together, words rearranged into commands Jonah had never spoken. Jonah felt cold. This wasn't documentation. It was fabrication. Atlas stood suddenly, ears forward, body tense. As one of the clips replayed, a faint, high-pitched distortion threaded through the audio. Atlas whimpered softly, backing away from the screen. Jonah froze. That sound, barely audible to human ears, was familiar. A psychological trigger, used overseas to disorient, confuse, induce panic. Someone had embedded it in the footage. "Greg," Jonah whispered. "This wasn't about being late. It never had been." Across town, Eleanor Whitmore sat at her desk, files spread before her. The storm outside had returned, rain tapping steadily against the window. She hadn't planned on getting involved, but plans change when injustice shows its face. She made a call. "Clear my morning," she said calmly, "and notify legal. I'll be attending a corporate review meeting." The voice on the other end hesitated. "About the restaurant?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "About the man who saved my life." Back at Jonah's house, headlights swept across the front window. Atlas growled. Jonah moved quietly, peering through the curtain. A car idled at the curb. The driver never got out. After a long moment, it pulled away. Jonah exhaled slowly. Whoever planted that flash drive hadn't meant for him to keep it, and now they knew he had it. Now let me ask you something. Be honest. If you uncovered proof that someone deliberately destroyed your career, would you expose them, even if it put you in danger? And do you think Eleanor's involvement will protect Jonah or make things worse? Leave your answer in the comments, because the next morning, in a room full of executives and lies, the truth would finally be forced into the light. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed. What happens in this part flips the entire story, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The corporate conference room didn't feel real to Jonah. The walls were too clean, the chairs too polished. The air smelled faintly of coffee and expensive cologne, nothing like grease or smoke or rain. Jonah sat at the far end of the long table, hands folded, posture straight. Atlas lay beneath his chair, calm but alert, amber eyes scanning every movement like a silent witness. Across from Jonah sat Greg Mallory. He looked different outside the diner. Smaller, stiffer. His confidence didn't fill the room the way it once filled the kitchen. Still, his jaw was set in defiance, hands clasped tightly as if gripping an invisible lifeline. The regional director cleared his throat. "We're here to address allegations of misconduct, falsified safety reports, and wrongful termination." Jonah said nothing. Greg laughed lightly. "This is all a misunderstanding." Then the doors opened. The room shifted. Eleanor Whitmore entered without raising her voice, yet every head turned. She wore a deep red coat and carried herself with quiet authority, the kind earned over decades, not demanded. She took a seat beside Jonah, placing a familiar woven basket on the table between them. "I asked for this meeting because a man sitting in this room pulled me from a burning car while your employee documentation was being manufactured." Greg's face drained of color. The director frowned. "Manufactured?" Eleanor nodded. "You'll want to see this." She gestured to Jonah. Jonah slid the flash drive across the table. The footage played. Once, twice. Slow motion analysis followed. Time-stamped discrepancies. Audio manipulation. Digital artifacts no authentic recording could produce. Silence swallowed the room. One executive leaned forward. "This is edited." "Yes," Eleanor replied. "Intentionally." Greg stammered. "That dog, he's unstable. He caused distractions." Atlas rose. Not aggressively, not loudly. He stepped forward and placed one paw on Jonah's boot. Still, steady. The room fell quiet again. "That dog," Eleanor said softly, "has more integrity than most people I've met." The director closed his folder. "Greg Mallory, you are suspended effective immediately pending full investigation." Greg stood abruptly. "You can't—" Security was already moving. As Greg was escorted out, his eyes locked briefly on Jonah. Not anger, fear. When the door closed, the director turned back to Jonah. "Mr. Hale, we owe you an apology." Jonah exhaled for the first time in days. "I don't want my job back," he said quietly. "I want the truth on record." Eleanor smiled. "Good, because this is only the beginning." Outside, Atlas stepped into the sunlight, tail wagging once, slow, satisfied. Justice, it seemed, had finally caught up. But what Eleanor revealed to Jonah afterward about why Atlas reacted to her in the storm would change how he saw the past and the future. The lake was calm that afternoon, its surface broken only by drifting ice and soft ripples from the warming wind. Jonah stood at the edge of the dock, hands in his jacket pockets, staring out at the water like it might answer questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. Atlas sat beside him, alert but relaxed, tail resting against the weathered wood. Behind them, Eleanor Whitmore eased herself onto a bench, moving slower than she liked, but refusing help. She watched Jonah for a long moment before speaking. "There's something I never told you about the night my family died," she said. Jonah turned. "The storm?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Yes, but also what came after." She folded her hands in her lap. "When the car burned, I was thrown clear. I remember screaming. I remember the heat. And then," she swallowed, "a dog." Jonah stiffened. "A German shepherd," Eleanor continued, "military trained. He came out of the rain like he'd been sent. He stayed with me until help arrived, pressed against me, wouldn't leave." Atlas lifted his head. "My son, Michael," she said softly, "he loved dogs, wanted to train them one day. He called that dog his guardian angel." Jonah felt his breath catch. "That unit," Eleanor added, eyes on Atlas now, "was deployed overseas months later. I searched for years but never found records of the handler." Jonah knelt slowly beside Atlas, resting a hand on his fur. "Atlas was deployed early in my service, before he was assigned to me." Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet tears. "That's why he looked at me the way he did. He remembers." Atlas leaned into Jonah's touch, calm, certain. "That night on the highway was the first time since my family died that I didn't feel alone in a storm." The wind moved gently across the lake. Jonah finally understood. Some bonds didn't belong to time. Some memories lived deeper than names. Eleanor reached into her coat and handed Jonah a sealed envelope. "Not yet. When the time feels right." Jonah nodded, though unease flickered beneath gratitude. Because when someone gives you something with that much finality, it's never just a gift. And when Jonah finally opened that envelope, he would realize Eleanor hadn't just repaid a debt. She had entrusted him with a legacy. Jonah opened the envelope 3 days later. He didn't rush it. Something about the weight of it, thin paper, heavy meaning, made him wait until the house was quiet. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, nothing like the storm that had started all of this, but enough to stir memory. Atlas lay nearby, watching. Inside the envelope was a single letter, written in elegant, deliberate handwriting, and a second folded document sealed with a legal stamp. Jonah read the letter first. "Jonah, some people enter our lives for a moment and change the direction of everything. You and Atlas did that for me. What you gave me wasn't rescue, it was restoration." His throat tightened. She wrote about her husband, about her son, about the years she'd spent building a foundation meant to support veterans who came home with invisible wounds, about how she was tired in a way sleep could never fix. "I have no heirs," the letter continued, "but I do have faith. Faith in people who act when no one is watching." Jonah unfolded the second document. It was a formal appointment. Not a donation, not a thank you check. Eleanor Whitmore was offering him leadership of her foundation, full authority, full responsibility, effective immediately if he chose to accept. Jonah leaned back in his chair, stunned. "Atlas, I think she's lost her mind." Atlas huffed softly, tail thumping once. The next morning, Jonah met Eleanor at her home overlooking the lake. She looked smaller somehow, thinner than before, but her eyes were clear. "You don't have to say yes," she told him, "but if you do, you'll never work for people who don't respect you again." Jonah hesitated. "I'm not a businessman." She smiled. "Neither was I at first. I was just someone who refused to look away." Silence stretched between them. Jonah thought about the diner, the lies, the quiet complicity. Then he thought about veterans he'd known, men and women who'd come back changed and been forgotten. "I'll do it," he said finally, "but I won't do it alone." Eleanor glanced at Atlas. "I wouldn't expect you to." Atlas rose, tail wagging slowly, as if the decision had already been made long before Jonah spoke. That evening, Jonah stood outside the empty diner he used to work at, watching people pass by without noticing him. For the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt redirected. But just when Jonah believed the storm was behind him, Eleanor's health took a sudden turn, and the true cost of legacy would be revealed. Jonah woke to Atlas barking, not the sharp warning bark, not the territorial growl. This was panic. Jonah was on his feet instantly, heart racing as he followed the sound down the hallway. The bedroom door was open. Eleanor lay on the floor beside her bed, one hand outstretched, her red coat half draped over the mattress as if she'd been reaching for it when her body failed. "Eleanor!" Jonah dropped to his knees. Atlas paced tightly around her, whining, nudging her shoulder with his nose. Jonah checked her pulse, weak, irregular. His training took over. He elevated her head, stabilized her breathing, and called emergency services without hesitation. His voice stayed calm, controlled, even as fear burned behind his eyes. "Stay with me," he said softly. "You're not alone." Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered. "Not again," she whispered. Atlas pressed against her side, solid, warm. Sirens cut through the night minutes later. Paramedics moved fast, lifting her onto a stretcher. Jonah rode in the back, one hand on the rail, Atlas locked beside him, silent but unwavering. At the hospital, hours stretched thin. Fluorescent lights hummed. Doctors spoke in careful tones. Cardiac arrhythmia, years of stress, a body that had carried grief longer than it should have. "She's stable," a nurse finally said. But this was serious. Jonah exhaled, knees nearly giving out. Eleanor woke just before dawn. Her first words weren't about pain or fear. "Did he stay?" she asked. Jonah smiled faintly. Didn't move an inch. Her eyes drifted to Atlas. "Good boy," she whispered. Later that day, Eleanor asked for privacy with Jonah. Her voice was weaker now, but clearer somehow, like someone who had made peace with something inevitable. "Promise me something," she said. "If I don't get another chance, don't let the work stop." Jonah swallowed hard. "You're not done yet." She smiled sadly. "None of us ever know when we are." She pressed another envelope into his hand, thicker this time. "Not today," she said again, "but soon." Jonah didn't argue. That night, Jonah sat by the hospital window while Atlas slept at his feet. The city lights shimmered like distant stars. The storm hadn't returned, but Jonah knew now some storms didn't announce themselves. And when Eleanor finally slipped away, Jonah would discover that her final gift wasn't money, it was a purpose he could never walk away from. Eleanor passed 2 weeks later. There was no storm that night, no thunder, no rain. Just quiet. Too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jonah received the call just after dawn. He didn't speak for a long time after hanging up. Atlas sat beside him, pressing his weight gently against Jonah's leg, grounding him in the moment. "She's gone," Jonah whispered. Atlas lowered his head, ears folding back, not in panic, not in fear, but in understanding. The memorial was small, held by the lake Eleanor loved. Spring had begun to soften the shoreline, green pushing stubbornly through what winter had tried to claim. People spoke of Eleanor Whitmore as a philanthropist, a visionary, a woman of influence. Few spoke of her as Jonah knew her, the woman who shook in thunderstorms, the mother who never stopped missing her son, the survivor who finally felt safe. After the service, Jonah returned to her house alone. The lawyers had already been there. The paperwork was prepared. The house felt different now, emptier, but not hollow. On the kitchen table sat the second envelope. Jonah didn't sit down. He opened it standing. Inside was a handwritten letter and a copy of her will. "Jonah, if you're reading this, then I've already gone where storms can't follow." His vision blurred. "I chose you not because you saved me, but because you stayed, because you acted when no one was watching, because Atlas remembered what I couldn't say out loud." The will transferred everything. The house, the land by the lake, the Whitmore Veterans Foundation. All of it to Jonah Hale. With one condition: continue the work, feed the forgotten, shelter the weary, give purpose back to those the world discards. Jonah sank into a chair. "This is too much," he whispered. Atlas walked over and rested his head on Jonah's knee, steady and warm. In that moment, Jonah understood something painful and beautiful all at once. Eleanor hadn't given him a gift. She had entrusted him with her unfinished story. And what Jonah chose to build from that legacy would turn a place of loss into a symbol of second chances. The sign went up on a bright spring morning. Fresh wood, clean paint, simple lettering. Second Chance Grill. Jonah stood across the street with his hands in his jacket pockets, studying it like it might disappear if he blinked. Atlas sat at his side, tail sweeping the pavement in slow, content arcs. The building itself had once been an abandoned diner, cracked windows, faded booths, a place no one had believed was worth saving. Jonah had believed. Renovations took months. Long days, longer nights. Volunteers showed up quietly at first, veterans who'd heard whispers of a place being built by one of their own. Some brought tools, some brought food, some just stayed to talk while they worked. Jonah hired them all. No resumes, no explanations required. Just willingness. Inside the kitchen, laughter returned where tension once lived. Mistakes were corrected without humiliation. Meals were cooked with care, not fear. And at the center of it all, Atlas became a fixture, lying near the entrance, greeting guests with calm authority, reminding everyone that this place was safe. Opening day drew a crowd Jonah hadn't expected. Families, seniors, veterans in worn jackets, even a few people from his old workplace, standing uncertainly at the edge of the sidewalk. Jonah didn't turn anyone away. A young man approached the counter late in the afternoon. He couldn't have been more than 22, hands shaking, eyes tired. "You hiring?" he asked quietly. Jonah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Can you show up?" The man swallowed. "Yes." "Then you're hired." The man's shoulders sagged in relief. From the lake across the road, sunlight shimmered off the water. Jonah glanced at it briefly, imagining Eleanor there somehow, watching, approving. That night, after the last table was cleared and the doors were locked, Jonah sat alone in a booth. Atlas curled up at his feet. "We did it," Jonah said softly. Atlas thumped his tail once. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had finally been transformed. Because just when life seemed settled, someone from Jonah's past returned, bringing a truth that would challenge everything he'd built. It was nearly closing time when the knock came. Jonah was wiping down the counter, the smell of warm bread and herbs still hanging in the air. Most of the staff had already clocked out, laughter fading as they stepped into the cool evening. Atlas lay by the door, eyes half closed, relaxed in a way Jonah had learned to trust. Then Atlas stood. Not suddenly, not aggressively, deliberately. His ears lifted, his body aligned with the door. One low breath escaped his chest. Not a growl, but a signal. Jonah set the towel down. The knock came again, firm, careful. Jonah opened the door. A man stood on the threshold, rain-darkened jacket pulled tight around his frame. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, eyes sharp but tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in years. He looked past Jonah, then down at Atlas. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Recognition. "You're Jonah Hale," the man said. Jonah nodded slowly. "Depends who's asking." The man exhaled. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I was assigned to Canine Transport and Reassignment 8 years ago." Jonah's chest tightened. Daniel glanced again at Atlas. "I moved him." Atlas stepped forward, sniffed the man's hand once, then sat. Jonah didn't invite Daniel in right away. "Why are you here?" Daniel swallowed. "Because I saw the news. About the foundation. About Eleanor Whitmore." He hesitated. "And because there's something you deserve to know." They sat in a booth near the window. Atlas positioned himself between them, calm but attentive. Daniel spoke quietly. Atlas wasn't just any canine. He was part of a pilot program. Dogs trained not only for combat, but for emotional imprinting. Jonah frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Daniel said carefully, "that Atlas was trained to anchor to moments of extreme trauma. Not just to protect, but to remember, to return." Jonah's pulse quickened. That night, Eleanor lost her family. Atlas was deployed nearby on a joint exercise. He broke formation during the chaos, stayed with her until responders arrived. Jonah stared at Atlas. "We weren't supposed to let that happen, but sometimes some bonds form before we can stop them." Silence settled between them. "So when Atlas found her again," Jonah said slowly, "it wasn't coincidence." Daniel shook his head. "No, it was completion." Atlas rested his chin on Jonah's knee. Daniel stood to leave. "I'm glad he ended up with you." After the door closed, Jonah sat unmoving for a long time. Some stories didn't end. They waited. And when Jonah finally understood why Atlas had been placed in his life from the very beginning, he would realize destiny had been guiding them both all along. Jonah didn't tell anyone about Daniel Mercer's visit. Not the staff, not the board, not even the veterans who trusted him with their stories every day. Some truths weren't meant to be shared immediately. They needed time to settle, to reveal their shape. But once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. Jonah started noticing things. Atlas always positioned himself near people who sat alone the longest. He lingered beside guests whose hands trembled when thunder rolled outside. He stayed especially close to veterans who laughed too loudly or stared too long at nothing. It wasn't random. One afternoon, a former Marine named Cal broke down in the middle of lunch service. The sound of a dropped tray had triggered something deep. Before Jonah could react, Atlas was already there, leaning his weight gently against Cal's leg, breathing slow and steady. Cal cried, openly, for the first time in years. Afterward, he said quietly, "That dog, he brought me back." Jonah watched it happen again and again. Atlas wasn't just present, he was placed. That night, Jonah pulled out old service records and adoption paperwork he'd never questioned before. Dates, transfers, deployments. Atlas had been reassigned to Jonah's unit 2 weeks after Jonah lost 3 men under his command. Not before, after. Jonah closed his eyes. Atlas had found him when he was broken, just like Eleanor, just like Cal. The foundation grew quickly after that, not in size, but in depth. Group meals turned into support circles. Job training evolved into mentorship. People stayed long after their plates were cleared, talking in low voices while Atlas moved quietly among them, grounding, steady. Jonah began speaking publicly, not as a leader, but as someone still learning. "We don't heal alone," he told a small crowd one evening. "We heal when someone stays." Later that night, Jonah walked the lake path with Atlas under a sky full of stars. The air was cool, peaceful. "You were never meant to be mine," Jonah said softly. "You were meant to pass through." Atlas stopped walking. He turned, sat, looked up at Jonah with those knowing amber eyes. Jonah laughed quietly. Or maybe we were meant to walk together for a while. Atlas leaned against him. Some patterns weren't meant to be broken. They were meant to be followed. And when the Foundation faced its first real test, one that threatened to shut it all down, Jonah would have to decide how much he was willing to risk to protect what they'd built. The letter arrived without warning. Official. Heavy. Sealed with language that made Jonah's stomach tighten before he even opened it. He stood behind the counter of Second Chance Grill, Atlas at his side, as he read the words twice, then a third time. Notice of compliance review. Immediate suspension pending investigation. Jonah exhaled slowly. Someone had filed a complaint. Improper hiring practices, unlicensed support animal, misuse of charitable funds. On paper, it sounded damning. In reality, it was a challenge. By noon, rumors were already spreading. A few regulars asked questions in hushed voices. Staff members exchanged worried looks. One of the younger vets, Lena, pulled Jonah aside. "Are we in trouble?" she asked quietly. Jonah met her eyes. "We're being tested." That afternoon, inspectors arrived. Clipboards, sharp suits, colder expressions. They asked about Atlas first. "Is this animal certified?" Atlas lay calmly at Jonah's feet, unmoving. "He's trained, extensively." "That's not an answer," one inspector said. Jonah didn't raise his voice. "Then you're asking the wrong question." They moved on to finances. Housing assistance, meals served for free, volunteers paid under the table. Jonah answered everything honestly. When they left, the building felt hollow. That night, Jonah sat alone in the darkened dining room, lights off, chairs stacked. Atlas rested his head on Jonah's knee. "If this ends, I need you to know it was worth it." Atlas huffed softly. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Then the calls began. Veterans, families, social workers, donors, people Jonah didn't even know. They wrote letters, submitted statements, shared stories, how this place kept them alive when nothing else had. On the day of the review, the room overflowed. One by one, people stood. A single mother, a former addict, a retired medic, a teenager who said Atlas stopped him from ending everything. When Jonah finally spoke, his voice was steady. "This place exists because people stayed," he said. "If that's a violation, then I'll accept the consequences." Silence followed. Then the chairwoman closed her folder. She said, "We're not shutting you down." Relief rippled through the room. But the fight wasn't over yet, because just as Jonah thought they'd won, a final revelation about Atlas would change the Foundation forever. The room was almost empty now. Folding chairs scraped softly as the last of the review board members filed out, murmuring among themselves. The Foundation had survived, but only just. Conditions were attached. New oversight. Stricter rules. One clause, however, sat heavier than the rest. Atlas. Jonah sat alone at the long table, the official documents spread open in front of him. Atlas lay at his feet, calm as ever, unaware that his future was being debated in ink and signatures. The clause was simple and cruel. All non-certified support animals must be removed from daily operations. Jonah read it again. And again. A knock sounded at the door. The chairwoman stepped back in, her expression softer now that the audience was gone. "Off the record," she said, "this isn't personal. Liability rarely is." Jonah nodded. "He's not equipment," she sighed. "I know, but rules don't bend for meaning." That night, Jonah walked the lake path with Atlas under a sky streaked with stars. The air smelled of damp earth and spring leaves. Everything was quiet in the way that came just before a hard decision. "You've done enough," Jonah said softly, stopping near the water's edge. Atlas sat, watched him. Jonah crouched, resting his forehead against the dog's. His throat tightened. "If keeping you costs this place, I don't know what the right answer is." Atlas licked Jonah's cheek once. Calm. Certain. The next morning, Jonah stood before the Foundation staff and volunteers. "They want Atlas gone," he said simply. Murmurs filled the room. Jonah raised a hand. "So here is my decision." He took a breath. "Atlas stays." Silence. "I'll step back if I have to," Jonah continued. "But this foundation was built on staying when it's easier to leave. I won't betray that." A moment passed. Then Lena spoke. "Then neither will we." Others followed, one by one. Jonah felt something warm settle in his chest. Not victory, but alignment. And in the final chapter, fate would answer Jonah's choice in a way no rule book could have predicted. The ruling arrived on a quiet morning. No crowd, no tension-filled room, just an email marked "Final Determination" sitting unread in Jonah's inbox while he brewed coffee behind the counter of Second Chance Grill. Atlas lay by the door, tail sweeping the floor lazily as sunlight spilled through the front windows. Jonah opened the message. One sentence stood out. "Special exemption granted under Community Therapeutic Services." He read it twice, then laughed, softly, disbelievingly. Atlas lifted his head. "You're officially irreplaceable," Jonah said, crouching to scratch behind the dog's ears. Word spread fast. By noon, the place was full, not with celebration, but with something quieter and deeper. Gratitude. Relief. People didn't cheer. They stayed. They ate. They talked. They healed. That evening, Jonah walked the lake path alone with Atlas, the same path where so many hard conversations had taken place. The water was still now, reflecting the sky like glass. "You brought us all here," Jonah said. "You know that, right?" Atlas stopped, sat, and looked out over the lake. Jonah followed his gaze and smiled. In the distance, a woman in a red coat stood at the shoreline. Not solid, not imagined. A memory. Eleanor Whittemore, watching peacefully, as if satisfied. Jonah didn't chase the vision. He didn't question it. Some things didn't need explanation. Second Chance Grill continued to grow, not into an empire, but into a refuge, a place where people learned that being broken didn't mean being discarded, that storms passed, that someone staying could change everything. Atlas grew older, slower, but no less steady. When his steps finally faltered, Jonah stayed with him, just as Atlas had always stayed with others. And when Atlas was gone, his presence never really left. Because legacies aren't built from power or profit. They're built from moments when someone chooses to stop in the rain. And if this story reminded you that kindness still matters, then maybe, just maybe, you were meant to hear it too.